You fool! Warren is dead. Welcome to HorrorBabble. We're back today with The Damp Man Again by the great Allison V. Harding, the third of 3 stories concerning the titular character, which was published in the May 1949 edition of Weird Tales. Further dreadful evidence in the strange chronicle of a dreaded person. See the video description for a link to the Damp Man playlist. And, without further ado, The Damp Man Again by Allison V. Harding. 1. Experiences with madmen seem commonplace, judging by the daily press, but an individual case among one's own acquaintance is less easy to come upon. The mad experimentalists, dear both to the hearts of Hollywood Grade B movie producers and the writers of thrill fiction, are, happily for the general populace, something of a rarity. George Pelgrim of the Gazette, and one of that newspaper's ablest and most discerning reporters, was well aware that, in this instance, he had a sensational and bona fide case of the kind that would abash even some of the most colourful writers of lurid make-believe. The adventures that Pelgrim had just had with the Damp Man, that fabulous, beyond normal, unhuman, the living testimony of an experiment which should never have been undertaken, had stimulated the young reporter's mind to a degree that made the taboo attitude on the story from his city desk hard to take. The Damp Man, Lothar Remsdorf Jr., now no more, Pelgrim mused as he sat in the huge old house at View Cliffs overlooking the sea, was an explosive subject. The man himself, even if not that in the true sense biologically, had borne a name that meant both wealth and power. Enough wealth and power to squash not only a relatively insignificant reporter like Pelgrim, but also any paper, however large and influential, that stood behind him. A sample of this that still loomed large in George's mind was the memory of the fact, incredible but true, that Remsdorf, to suit his purposes at the end of their recent duel, had even bought Pelgrim's paper, the Gazette. A man who would go to such extremes to further some small phase of his outlandish plans was, of course, not sane. Remsdorf had not been sane any more than he'd been normal. A man of strange, peculiar content, his body filled with an outlandish physiological proportion of water, immune to many of the menaces from which the average flesh cringes. For a well-aimed bullet or knife thrust, an open door for the letting of the life's blood of any other individual, was merely as a gnat's bite to Remsdorf. The man had no blood in the medical man's sense of the word, but merely a watery, colourless substance. His vital organs, despite the immense size of him, were compressed and hidden away within the fluid fat monstrousness of the creature. There was a brain that could guide the senses, the sight and hearing and speech, and it could think with a cunning that far exceeded the average. Lothar Remsdorf Jr.'s obsession was the obsession that is often peculiarly the part of the abnormal. In his awful abnormality, with its connotations of inferiority, he will develop a philosophy that finally accepts the certitude that the inferiority, the difference is, in reality, a vast superiority. It was Lothar Remsdorf's undying obsession, his destiny, that he would found a new race that drove him along strange paths and byways, into actions of both criminal and murderous intent. The fact that he chanced upon Linda Mallory, the blonde swimmer of statuesque beauty, was undoubtedly coincidence. But with this aquatic star, Remsdorf's dream of a new racial empire flourished. The girl's feelings concerning his sinister advances mattered not one whit, and it was in this connection that George, covering a swimming meet, had met Linda, filled with fear instead of a swimming victor's sense of satisfaction. The persistent efforts of Remsdorf Jr. to force Linda to become his bride, to kidnap her or to obtain her by any means or method, made for an incredulous tale that his own gazette would have none of. But Pelgrim had kept an account of the happenings, and as a self-styled biographer of the Remsdorf case, he was unquestionably more intimate with it than any other living person. George had long since taken the exhausted Linda Mallory back to the city, but something composed in part of curiosity and part of compulsion sent him back on a return trip to the old mansion overlooking the sea. He had let himself in through a side door, purposely left open, and found himself surrounded by the sombre, huge emptiness of the ancient building in that part of night that is deepest and most silent. The basement, turned into an experimental chamber, held little but paraphernalia and equipment, most of which were beyond his ken. He worked methodically from room to room, the single ray of his flashlight probing and searching here and there. Now the wind from seaward would rattle a shutter or whistle in the eaves, and he would straighten, and for a moment chill with expectation. Then the reassuring thought of the monster's demise would soothe his tired and jangled nerves, and Pelgrim would go back to his searching. Upstairs, in a giant, black-panelled room with high-vaulted ceiling, George found himself face to face with a huge portrait of Lothar Remsdorf Jr. It seemed huge because the man was huge. The painting was life-size, realistic even down to the drab black clothes, the broadness and grossness, and the white fleshy face, eyes almost inhuman hidden behind puffs of cheekbones and eyebrows. The likeness was extraordinary. The eyes looked forward directly into George's own eyes, and if he moved around the room from any point in it, he could feel them on him. The mouth was stern, the thick lips set. The artist, whoever he may have been, had certainly captured the very spirit and soul of his sinister subject. Or, George's journalistic mind admitted precisely, the painter had captured the very soullessness of the creature. It was while the Gazette's reporter was looking full into the portrait's face that he had the sudden idea that was almost a compulsion sending him forward. He swiveled the picture, and its hanging wire swiveled it further, and there behind it was the knob of a wall safe. In the workroom of the basement, George soon found a crowbar. Returning, he attacked the hiding place with vigor, and after a while, its smallness and vulnerability gave in to the attack. The door sagged open on metal hinges, and he shoved his light inside. There was, of course, the instantaneous disappointment of not finding neat pack after pack of crisp high-denomination bills. George had never opened a safe before, but his fiction reading told him to expect something of that nature. Instead, there was nothing inside here but a book. He drew it out and opened its brown leather cover. It was a diary, the diary of Lothar Remsdorf Jr. Pelgrim carefully pushed the bent safe door back into some approximation of its original position, swiveled the picture into place, and found himself a relatively comfortable inside room, where the light from his torch could not possibly be seen from outside. He was, he reminded himself, trespassing in every sense of the word. The facts of what had taken place in that house early that night mattered not in the eyes of the law, and their unquestioned feeling towards him should he be apprehended roaming around a house to which he did not belong. In spite of this, Pelgrim settled into a chair and found himself reading. As he followed the words put down in a tight scroll on the lined pages of the diary, he felt himself living through the eyes and senses of the person or thing who'd written these words. As he perused page after page, his mind flashed back to his earlier episodes with the damp man, back to the events in this very house, and such a little while ago, when Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had contrived to make Linda Mallory into the same sort of being that he himself was, so that between them there had come to be a race of different and superior biological and physiological creatures. As Pelgrim read on, he found himself walking down the dark streets of night with Remsdorf Jr., in many strange places. The damp man's thoughts became his own, perhaps not necessarily through any power of Lota's writings in the diary, but because of Pelgrim's own imagination and his intimacy with the whole Outre affair. When Lota Remsdorf Jr. walked the outskirts of an industrial town, finding a little factory girl who resisted his advances, Pelgrim could feel the whole thing. And that moment, the same night, with her referring to the damp man as, "You fat slob, get away from me," he could see the sudden burst of energy that transformed the elephantine monster into a lightning-quick creature of distraction for all his size. And he could visualize the slack, limp thing that lay at the side of the road beyond the outskirts of the farthest lights from the tavern, a bundle of useless inertness that a moment ago had been the factory girl, who had decided with a woman's right that Remsdorf wasn't the kind of fellow she wanted to have an evening's fun with. Lota Remsdorf Jr. had but to write a check for any amount, and the money was his. It was a fact of his life that he accepted as he accepted his physical proportions, which were immense, and those other things. The father that had begot him, the scientist-experimentalist father, was, he felt very sure, destroyed now in a burst of maniacal frenzy against the man whose blunder had done this to him, like a drunken mother who drops her year-old baby downstairs, dooming it to life as a cripple. For Lota had known. It had been evident, as his mind had grown to catch up with his body, from the first time perhaps that he had shaved, and the blade, as it will with men all over the world, had slipped and cut deeply, and what had spurted forth had not been blood. Not blood, but a strange, watery serum. He remembered the country physician he'd seen almost by accident in some small community when he'd crushed his hand at some now-forgotten task. The physician, on examining him, had been amazed. There had been questions, so many questions that Remsdorf had finally fled, not answering, leaving the country practitioner to doubt his own sanity, to inquire into the back recesses of his mind if he'd been drunk the night the man with the crushed hand came, or if he, a humble country doctor, had seen the ninth wonder of the world. Remsdorf's injured hand had filled and righted itself, and he found that physical injuries and diseases to which the flesh of normal men falls heir were not to be his. But there were other matters less advantageous. With all his cellular and metabolic differences, there was a likeness to his fellow men that made his path difficult. Like his fellow men, he sat through his share of burlesque shows and musical comedies, ogling the stripped and semi-stripped females that paraded their tired bodies before the public. And, as time passed, his yearning, which was a part of some other man he might have been before those things that had been done to him, that yearning became a hatred, and the hatred a scheming cunning. With his money, of course there were girls. For enough money you can get almost anything in this world. Sad, but true. They were girls from the poorer circumstances of life as a rule, whose loathing for him showed through their set smiles as they accepted his advances as a necessary part of a very unpleasant way of getting by. He looked at them as one does at dolls in a toy store, and these that came to him were of usual kinds. Most of them were scrawny, with pasty faces and straight hair, thin bodies and high-pitched voices. There were some that were fleshy, lumpy, and bulging in the wrong places, their figures sagging with their memories, trying to appear younger than they were, which wasn't young. In common, the thin and the fat had their dyed hair and their screeching voices and their speech, which was hep, they liked to think, and in the vernacular. And they hated him, which he knew, and he hated them, which in all their smallness of soul and stupidity they still did not know. But they were none of them what he wanted, for gradually Lothar Remsdorf Jr. was evolving a plan and an idea which would make of him not a despised, loathsome creature, but a superior Superman, which was what he indubitably was. He was, he knew by now with a real understanding, something like that fictional thrill-getter, the zombie, the walking dead. Things in his midnight wanderings and experiences happened to him that would injure, cripple, or kill an ordinary mortal. He was, for instance, hit by an auto on Chicago State Street one night. The auto was going much too fast, and his heavy body was thrown through the air to land with a wet smack on the curbstones. But, he thought with some amusement afterward, the woman driver's shock was much greater when she saw him rise, leaving behind no blood but the damp imprint of his great abnormal body on the sidewalk, than if he had remained there, a self-respecting corpse in a pool of honest blood. Oh, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had something. He was relatively invulnerable. Who knows, he might be immortal. It was a titillating thought, and spurred him on to find the maiden of his ideal with whom he could appropriately start a new and mightier racial strain. There was, first of all, Joy. He'd seen her first at a fashionable country club horse show, her raven-black hair falling down around her perfect oval face, the riding habit setting off the well-built figure as she sat her horse. Introductions had to be made. At that level people were considerably more conventional, as the educated usually are. For to the world, Remsdorf appeared simply as a large and obese man with a somewhat forbidding, unhandsome face, and a penchant, if he did not disguise the fact with his dark clothes, of perspiring too much. However, Joy was easy, and the whole thing looked quite propitious. With the introductions and the behind-the-hands whispering that probably dealt with his size and unattractiveness were words from the same sources that spoke of his immense wealth. And it so happened at that moment in the world's history that Joy Sutter's family were hard up and in considerable need of some refinancing. That irrevocable fact helped to gloss over some of Remsdorf's more obvious shortcomings. And before long, the damp man and the raven-haired beauty could be seen at country socials and functions. Remsdorf felt he was getting somewhere, with occasional invitations from the family. He realized and recognized in himself a consuming desire to at least ape other men in some ways, and marriage would be the logical consummation of this. Joy was an attractive playmate. Her limbs were well moulded, her face finely chiseled, and her family properly anxious, even if, as Remsdorf knew intuitively, it was his bankroll that concerned them, rather than the innate qualities that went with the man. The two talked occasionally, said what was necessary to and from the country club or the beach club, and as the weeks passed, Lothar permitted himself the measured optimism of one who sees his goal coming within reach. There had been, up to this time, no such intimacies as are commonplace among the young country sets. The night of the Frost Island barbecue, Remsdorf, arrayed in his usual dark suit, which had now come to be at least openly accepted by the beach club, squired Joy Sutter. The island was not far off the shore frontage of the yacht club, and the guests made the trip in small boats. It was a lark, as the girls in gay-coloured shorts or slacks and their escorts took to the water in whatever type of craft seemed most easily available. Some commandeered small sailing boats, while others with more ambition or stronger backs ventured forth in rowboats. There were a few power craft, and Joy whispered to Lothar of a skiff with outboard motor, of which she knew the whereabouts. The black-haired girl, who'd been reared in the sort of society that knew well its piano lessons, how to sit a horse, set a star canvas, and spin the flywheel of an outboard, showed her bulky companion the working of the small motor. Then, laughing at his clumsiness, she let Remsdorf take over, and they pushed off from land, following the others out across tranquil evening water to Frost Island. The trip took a good half-hour, but Lothar, watching the hair of the girl seated in the bow of the boat, the long tresses wind-blown backward like a dark pennant in the twilight, wished it took longer. They did not speak, because it was hard to be understood over the putt of the outboard, but once or twice she smiled at him, and it kindled the sense of anticipation Remsdorf had brought with him this night. For tonight he had decided to ask Joy, the blessing of her family assured, he knew, to be his wife. The barbecue was like a barbecue. They roasted frankfurters, toasted rolls, ate pickles, and played foolish games that were all the more foolish at their age. After a while, the liquid refreshments took on a potency that lessened the inhibitions of the party. As the gaiety of the picnickers increased, Remsdorf, taking a drink here and there for appearance sake, nevertheless found himself at the outskirts of the laughing, singing, and joking groups. It bothered him particularly that his Joy, he was allowing himself to think of her in that way now, was paying less and less attention to him as the evening progressed, and more to the group of tanned, broad-shouldered young men who inevitably circle around an attractive girl. It was possible, probable, that with the number of drinks consumed, Joy's concern for the hard circumstances surrounding the Sutter family's life diminished, and her perception of the attraction of other young men increased. Lothar made several attempts to catch her eye, and finally forced himself forward to stand by her side. "Joy," he said, in his rumbling, cavernous voice. She stopped laughing long enough to look at him briefly. "Let's walk up the beach a ways." She pointed at him and giggled, swaying a bit unsteadily on her feet. One of the tanned young men with the broad shoulders leaned forward to support her. "Who's your blimp boyfriend?" Everybody laughed. Remsdorf seethed and withdrew to stand again in the background, unseen, his dark suit blending into the night blackness of the island beyond the rim of firelight. Later, Remsdorf saw his chance and seized it. The cavaliers, drawn away by various drink-fetching tasks, left Joy standing alone for a minute, and in that time Remsdorf was by her again, drawing her away from the firelight. "No, no," she protested in a thick voice. "Don't want to go." But it was nothing for his thick arm to propel her as he wanted. It was getting late, and the rumble of anger in his own breast had found an answer far westward in the night sky. There was a storm coming, and after all, he had promised himself that tonight was to be theirs. He drew her down beside him on a rock facing the dark, now still water. The romance of the night was curtailed by her unwillingness, but he held her there, against any desire to run back to the young men at the barbecue. "Joy," he breathed, and the words came out with a giant exhalation. "I want you to be my wife." He had been holding her by the shoulder somewhat tightly, and became conscious of it when she relaxed completely. He thought that was the response he sought, but then he felt her shoulders heaving. He wondered why she sobbed, until the awful truth overtook him. It was laughter, and she shook with it. "You!" she finally managed to gasp. "You!" And then her words became unintelligible for the laughter. He felt a great shaking starting deep inside of him, but it was a different emotion from hers, and his giant arms and hands tensed. Your family," he rumbled, playing his strong card, which now seemed pitifully deuce low. "Your family, they approve." The girl swayed against him and away, as though moved inexorably by the gusts of her own mirth. "I marry you!" In a second more, he knew his rage would be a bigger thing than her laughter. But in that second, The gloom that shrouded this dreadful scene was flecked and streaked with bobbing light. It was one of the tanned young cavaliers carrying a torch and calling, "Joy! Joy, darling! Where are you?" She got up unsteadily, but quick enough to evade the damp man's grab, and then she was running towards the light and the young man, still giggling at the huge joke, chattering about it. And as she went back towards the barbecue, it seemed that those she met and learned of it laughed with her, until the sound was proportionately larger than the man who caused it. Then it began to rain, as it does on a summer night, softly and suddenly, without warning, from a sky that hides behind the darkness. It rained harder, as though for the unshed tears in Remsdorf's giant body, and the barbecue fire sputtered and sizzled out. The merrymakers oohed with disappointment and tried to tuck themselves away under what scant shrubbery the island afforded, the men holding jackets over the girls' heads. But the wind began to blow, and the wisest of the yacht club set advised that the trip back to the mainland should be started immediately, or they might well be stuck for the night on Frost Island. People ran, and the boats drawn up along the beach were rapidly filled. Remsdorf, forgotten now in the confusion and the big joke that he had afforded all of them, walked until he saw the boat Joy was in. It was raining even harder, and she was already in the prow. Bloater waited until the young man with the two broad shoulders had started the outboard and was about to push off. Remsdorf stepped forward then, got into the boat with an ungainly lurch, and shoved the young man hard, viciously. In the next instant, one giant leg had pushed out mightily, and they were afloat and free, the voice of the bested swain lost in the general confusion and the growing sounds of the storm. When Joy turned and saw his bulk at the outboard instead of the tanned young man, the flickering lightning showed her disgust, but the mirth was gone. The water that drove her black hair flat to her head had also driven some of the liquor out of her befuddled brain. She turned and stared ahead. For a while, there were other boats around, and Lothar steered by watching them. But in the blackness and rising water, they soon found themselves alone. He called out, the harsh rumble of his voice rising above the water slap against the hull and the beat of the rain. "Which way, Joy?" She hesitated a moment, and then pointed mutely. He wondered if she knew for sure, and that was a small joke for him. Water came over the prow now, and Joy moved back into the center of the skiff. The wind grew strong enough even to lift the heavy, wet strands of her hair, to spin their skiff this way and that, and cause this girl, who had derided him a moment ago, to turn her frightened, rain-streaked face towards him beseechingly. And that was when the damp man laughed, a hearty echo to her girlish peals of the earlier evening. "Scared, Joy?" he called above the shrieking wind, and she sat amidships and stared back at him, her eyes widened by what she saw in his face. Suddenly the words came, the hysteria, the cries and screams. But the boat drove on into the ever heavier seas, and the black water coming over the side slopped at their feet. She screamed again, but her words were unintelligible things. She prayed, she entreated, but there was no one to hear but Lothar Remsdorf, and he enjoyed this game more than any of the others they'd played on the island. She should enjoy it too, he thought ironically, for it would be her last. The skiff was narrow of beam, and as he moved his gigantic weight from one side to the other, the craft would dip sharply and take in more and more water. Joy would try to counterbalance by throwing herself against the lifted thwart, but it was as a matchstick. It was a glorious moment for him, as he drove the foundering skiff directly into the head sea, felt that last wave sweep into them and over them, and the boat, a dead, lonely thing now, drop away beneath them. She was at him, a cat in the water, clawing and grabbing, and if she made noise, the waves slapped it from her mouth. Her eyes were big from the horror of it, and gradually, using his weight easily, he forced her under by her shoulders, and then her head. He thought at the time that Joy's struggles were pitifully feeble, that this girl's effort for life was a poor thing, lasting for but a short time. He held her beneath the churning water with his knees and the full-length reach of his tremendous arms for a bit longer, and then pulled her up, holding her by the hair, looking at her face set in final, twisted agony. As he threw this dead, lifeless thing away from him, he wondered how he had ever found her pretty or desirable, and he was glad it had happened this way. Then he took to the business of swimming, an entirely familiar and effortless act, for water was his medium, and in water he revelled. His ponderous strokes did not speed, with concession to the storm, but took their time, and finally there was something under his feet. He found land, walked up on it a ways, and, although not feeling the need for rest, laid down when he was a reasonable distance from the water. It would look better this way. Joy was the only casualty, but 2 other boats had overturned, and there had been some close calls. Remsdorf was contriteness personified with the Sutters. He told his simple, straightforward story that they had been swamped in the storm, and at the first moment of going over, he had lost track of Joy in the confusion. He had called out and swum in circles as nearly as he could, but had not seen her again. The girl's body was found a few days later. The verdict of accidental drowning was confirmed, and at the ceremony the usual moistness of Remsdorf's face was taken for tears of exquisite sorrow. But the quest must continue. He knew that as he slipped away from the country community and made his way to the city. There were other girls, other trials and errors, but Remsdorf, with experience, was cagier. And then finally there was Terry. Terry, who sang with a band in a downtown joint. Two. Terry was young, maybe so young she had to lie her way into this present employment. She had looks and sparkle. She was medium-sized, with big, sensual breasts of a much larger girl. Remsdorf saw her first in her place of employment, singing some tired song about love and moon and June, in a low-cut evening dress that showed her off to considerable advantage. The song didn't matter. There are 10,000 husky contraltos, but the evening dress did. It caught his attention and every male eye in the place. A $20 bill to the head waiter got him through a dingy backstairs route to Terry's dressing room, and another 20 did wonders to get the introductions off running. "Miss Wilson, this is Mr. Loda Remsdorf, Jr. Says he liked your singing. Wanted to meet you." The eyebrow of the flunky dipped appropriately to signify, "Sucker, sucker. I got into him a little. Now it's your turn." "Thanks, Maurice." It was the same husky contralto, and it sounded good in the tiny, untidy dressing room, better even than when it whispered love and moon and June in front of the blasé 5-piece orchestra. Remsdorf said something about going out somewhere with him and having a drink. He'd like to talk to her about opportunities. She was still wearing the dress, and he ogled, and that pleased her, for that was obviously what the dress was for. The date was that easily arranged, and as promised, she met him later, after she'd had time to slip into something else. The something else was also entirely alluring, and as they chatted at an expensive uptown nightclub, Terry spoke of admiring clothes that bring out my personality. Remsdorf smirked at that, and thought the girl was either very stupid or very smart, but what did it matter? As time passed, Terry Wilson became the new addition of Joy Sutter. By this time, at considerable expense and trouble, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had amassed as much as possible of his father's scientific experimental data and notes prior to the explosion which had taken the scientist's life. They dealt in the main, of course, with the experiment of which the damp man himself was the product. It occurred to him, increasingly, that in the development of this new and biologically superior race on Earth, there should be as little as possible left to chance. The girl he would choose for the ultimate experiment would be subjected to the same radiatory and physiological therapies as he himself had withstood to emerge as he was now. Terry Wilson, all unknowing of course, accepted his gifts, saw him more than occasionally, and went on singing at the joint. It happened not too much later that Terry, one evening at an outside cafe, bent her finger around Lothar's suit cuff and cooed at him in her voice that came with the huskiness when she wanted something particularly. But this was troublesome because it could not be bought at a store. It was in the nature of a sort of ultimatum. "No, honey, I'm just not going to be able to see you next week. Got some friends coming on next week, and I'm going to be pretty busy." Remsdorf tried petulance, tried the suggestion that he would withdraw his generous patronage, but she made a face at him that said she knew he didn't mean it and couldn't do it. He took his troubles a few days later to the manager of the joint, where he'd first spied Terry. The manager's friendship and ear had been long since won over by good denomination bills from the Remsdorf wallet. The manager was a canny man. He had ideas. It was he who joked within hearing of his female singer about her low-cut dresses, saying that she sang with her body instead of her voice, which last she ain't got much of. Terry didn't seem to mind. The friends were people the joint's boss just didn't know much about, was all Remsdorf got for his pumping. The manager thought the Wilson girl had been in with a fast, tough kind of crowd, but what she did with her spare time was no concern of his, this with a shrug of the shoulder. Lothar hired a private detective, and that worthy stuck to Terry during the week when she couldn't see the damp man. His reports were duly filed. The chap, so discovered the damp man, was one Frankie Macklin, a boy with a bad reputation in the Midwest, a police record, and some dubious activities. Macklin had along with him a couple of rugged muscle men who'd also known the inside of a detention pen and looked it. The week up, the private eye went back to divorce cases, and Remsdorf went back to Terry. When he asked her who her friends were and how about an introduction, she blew smoke at him. "Just friends, Big Bear." She had a habit of calling him that, and he didn't mind. He'd been called worse things. It was a tug of war, and neither of them gave in. "Well, if you don't trust me, and anyway, you don't own me," she flounced off, looking, as the storybooks say, prettier in anger than he'd ever seen her. He stayed for all her appearances the next night, listened to her sing, and agreed more than ever with the critical opinion of her voice offered by the manager. When he tried to make up afterwards, she pouted. Phone calls to her hotel were not put through, and Remsdorf paced the floor, unable to rest his giant bulk until some break in their quarrel. As a few more days passed, the damp man pounded the lobby of her hotel. He ingratiated himself with the house detective there, only to find after the exchange of considerable folding stuff that Terry was no longer in the building, but had moved to another dwelling, the exact whereabouts unknown. His contacts at the joint also shrugged their shoulders. Where Miss Wilson lived, after all, was her own business. She didn't need to share that knowledge with her employers. Terry continued to warble her songs, and her low-cut dresses fascinated the patrons, as they had Remsdorf. Then, unexpectedly, he got a phone call from her. She was at the Apex Hotel. Could he come over? He went, and she greeted him affectionately in something flimsy. She apologized for her behavior, but she'd been in some trouble. Well, not recently, but something she'd inherited long ago from her family. She knew he'd understand, but it was important that she get out of this city. He knew how those things were. Now she had an opportunity somewhere else to get her own place, but it would take a little capital. Well, she didn't know how much. She didn't even know the exact details. Perhaps the whole thing wouldn't come off, but she just wondered if he wouldn't help her just a little. The meeting was one of forgiveness and promises. She ran her hand through his hair and pinched his big fleshy cheek. But once, when she turned her head away, he caught the look on her face in the across-room mirror. It was the same look he'd seen on so many women's faces. It made him feel as he'd felt many times before. But Terry, even playing at love, was better, he guessed, than most other girls in sincerity.
"Terry," he murmured in his rumbling, deep-from-within voice, "you know I'd back you in any venture and for any amount. There's something else, though. If you go away, I want to go wherever you go. You see, Terry, I've been thinking about asking you to become—"
She hushed him there, but with a mixture of shyness and provocativeness that made him feel he'd been gauche and abrupt. "Don't let's talk about that now," she pleaded. With a giant hand, he took his checkbook out of his pocket. "Oh dear, not that either now, Big Bear. Honey, you must think I'm interested in you just because you've got money." He left, and that part of him, that part of his highly sensitive and beyond normal cerebellum that told him the whole thing was a sham and a fake, was definitely subordinated to the rest of him that thrilled to her and her words and the evening they'd spent together. He went home, and the water-like serum that coursed through his veins and body pumped feverishly, his great hands gripping and ungripping, his mind filled with what would come next. In the next few days he saw Terry, but no more intimately than the others who came to the cheap night spot to ogle and hear her sing. She waved at him. Once he caught up with her just outside of her dressing room, and she shook her head with a little frown that stopped him. "No, please, I have so much to think about. I'm going to get in touch with you soon, though. I need you." That held Lothar until her summons. She called him one morning very early, so early that the position of the hands of the clock made him disbelieve that it could be her. "It's Terry," she repeated again. He sat up sleepily, holding the instrument in one huge, moist paw, but the huskiness of her voice charmed him, as it always had. The early hour took nothing away. "Look," she relayed, "this thing I've been telling you about. You know, I think the break's come. I'm quitting my job. After tonight's the last."
"You're leaving town?"
he rumbled. Yes, this is really an opportunity, darling. But I want you to go with me, and I was wondering—" Her voice hung there like ripe fruit refusing to drop until she continued. "You said," a slight inflection there, "you'd like to help."
"Of course I did, and I would."
"Well, you see, just to get started—"
"How much?"
broke in Remsdorf.
"Just tell me, and it's yours."
"It seems like an awful lot. $10,000?
"I'll get it as soon as the bank opens."
"You're a darling. I don't know what I'd do without you, Big Bear."
"When do you want it?"
he asked, pleased at the warmth in her voice. "I'll tell you," she thought audibly. "I've got a little feeling that maybe they won't be too keen about me after running out on the joint tonight. I think you'd better meet me somewhere and we'll leave. Is that okay?"
"Anything you say, Terry."
"I'll call you and tell you where later."
"As you say."
"Oh, and darling, I know the way you rich men are. Don't go and get that 10,000 in the great big fat bills I suppose you're used to. We're going to need it for silly things like train fare and hotels and getting settled out there, together." The "together" made Remsdorf hang up with pleasurable expectancy. Later in the day, He drew out the money in 5s, 10s, and 20s. It made a good-sized envelope full, and stuffed the whole in his inside breast pocket. He waited in his room that evening, his gigantic form overflowing the largest chair, big blunt fingers tapping restlessly on the telephone table. As midnight approached, he wondered if the bad night had caused any change in her plans, for it was storming outside, a continuous spring drizzle that streaked his high-up hotel room windows. But a few minutes after midnight, the phone jangled. He picked it up, and she said, "Darling, it's Terry. All set to meet me?"
"I've been waiting," he intoned.
"I'll tell you where." And she gave him an address across town. "That's not far from the uptown railway station," she said.
"Are they sorry you're leaving down there at the club?"
"Oh, heavens," she deplored. "Don't let's go into that. You know how these people are. Won't give you an inch if they think you can better yourself. I think Joe, the manager, is going to lasso me at the last minute to try and stop me from going. You be there and promptly at 1 sharp. There's a train a few minutes later we can catch." He agreed, dutifully. "Oh, and darling, you have the money, of course?" "Good. That's mighty important to us." He left the hotel in the rain, took a cab to the other side of town, to the directed address. It was in a poor section of warehouses and run-down tenements, just beyond the intersection where one of the squalid streets met the avenue. The railroad, which from here to downtown burrowed underground in its lower tunnel, came out into the open beneath the high-walled sides, to become further up an elevated that ran above the dirty city streets until it reached the outskirts to run level again and regain its true character. Lothar paid the cab off and stood on the corner under a dingy street lamp. His watch said 1:45. Better early than late. A rumble beneath the sidewalk on which he stood developed into a shooting, lighted thing that rushed out onto the suddenly exposed tracks beyond the embankment and opening of the tunnel. He watched the train flow westward, changing the semaphores as it fled beneath them, from green to red. With the train gone away into the distance, there was nothing left but the soft, persistent hiss of the rain. That, with the lateness of the hour, drove whatever life there might be left in these squalid surroundings far away, indoors. It contributed a feeling as though he were alone in the world, the damp man thought, and he did not for a minute dislike it. His watch showed a couple of minutes to 1, and he wondered if Terry would be on time, or if there would be some slip-up. A moment or so later, he heard from out somewhere beyond the wall of rain and dampness the single steeple chime of a bell tolling the hour. Another train vibrated the spot on which he stood, this time from the outward direction, roaring from the night into the greater darkness of the tunnel and the bright depot at Tube's End. Almost before the rumbling was gone, there was the sound of a motor. Headlights showed down the avenue, and soon the vehicle drew abreast of his position under the street lamp, stopping on the shadowed opposite side. He thought it must be Terry, and then knew he was wrong as 2 men got out of the back. But it must have something to do with her, with him, for they came directly forward. They were medium-sized men with fedoras and trench coats and hands in pockets. Their eyes were white under the street lamp, and their faces drawn and unpleasant. They said nothing, but came closer. The trench coat on the right crossed first, his fist coming out of a pocket. It held a club-like something, and it abruptly swung at the damp man's head. Still no word had been spoken, no sound, except the scuffing, quickened footwork of the two. The blow missed his head and thwacked into a mushy shoulder. Remsdorf grabbed the man with one arm in a bent hook, and then there were voices, sounds. The man squealed and said, "For Christ's sake, Frankie, get him!" The one addressed produced a revolver. "Let go of him. Let's have the dough." Remsdorf tightened his grip on the gasping opponent within his grasp. The car across the street spewed forth another figure, this time the driver, coming to reinforce. Utilizing his gigantic strength in sudden movement, Remsdorf flung the man he'd imprisoned brutally to the ground. There was a sickening thud of head against concrete, and the opposing force had been reduced by one. The one addressed as Frankie was snarling now. The black thing in his hand made noise, and Remsdorf's clothing at his side tugged and tore. Then a sweeping motion of his giant arm sent this man too, crashing to the ground. The third attacker had stopped abruptly, unnerved by the sudden change in the tide of battle, undecided whether to attack or flee. And in that second, the momentous hulk of the damp man was upon him, bearing him to the ground. Then there was almost no sound for a while, but the hissing of the rain. The hissing became louder, or perhaps it was the sound of bodies being dragged across concrete, two at a time, one hand on each collar. It was a game there at the embankment overlooking the mouth of the tunnel. It was a game between Remsdorf and the signals, and he rumbled with deep, moist laughter as he hoisted first one body and then the other over the fence that guarded the tracks below, toppling them down with a gentle shove. In the next moment, there was the small earthquake again, and a train poured out of its tunnel hiding place to tear and pound over those insignificant gunny sack-like things that lay across the rails. When Remsdorf turned with a smile on his wet face, the one called Frankie had raised himself on elbow, his face the face of one who has looked into hell and is too stunned to fully believe what he saw. But Frankie still had the black thing in his hand, and the revolver spoke again and again as the damp man moved for him slowly, laughing softly. The gun was useless with emptiness before Lota's measured treads took him within reach of the nearly prone figure on the sidewalk, its bullets wasted in the fluid mass of his monster body. The damp man kneeled on the other's chest, pinioning Frankie with his overwhelming weight, and tired of the railroad tunnel game, he placed his mammoth hands on the other man's head and turned it gently, and yet with a firmness that would allow no disobedience. Frankie may have been dead from shock and horror, but if not, the last twist of those hands did for him. The snap was like the sound made by children playing make-believe games with a wishbone, only a man is bigger than a chicken, and his neck vertebra is bigger than the chicken's wishbone. Frankie's head fell slackly, as Lothar Remsdorf, with sudden inspiration, gathered the gunsel up in his arms and made for the car parked across the street. The Apex Hotel was a 25-minute drive through wet streets, deserted in these small hours of the morning. It was a smallish building in an unpretentious section. It catered to the theatrical element, though, and Lothar knew that the lobby could not be counted upon to be empty, even at this hour of nearly 2 a.m. He parked the car a block away, looked up and down to see that the rain-swept street was empty of pedestrians or other traffic, and picked Macklin up with consummate ease, lugging the dead triggerman towards a side entrance, whose small plaque announced "Service, Deliveries." It took but a few devious minutes to find the fire stairs, to mount these stairs carrying the grisly, limp sack of what had once been human, finally reaching 6, Terry's room level. The damp man took his time tiptoeing down the thinly carpeted corridor until he came to the one room over whose door a transom glowed, showing there was light and life within. The damp man arranged Macklin at his leisure, and then rapped lightly on the door. Terry's voice answered him from within almost immediately. "Come on in. Door's open." Remsdorf turned the knob, pushed the door ajar, just enough to enable him to gently hoist Macklin through the aperture, holding him from behind and remaining himself out of sight. Terry was obviously expecting just what she saw. "Frankie, lover, it didn't take you long. Did you get that fat baboon's money?" It was perhaps only a matter of seconds that Remsdorf held the tableau, but it seemed to him much longer. And then, catering to the searching anger that her remark caused, he took his hand of support from Macklin, at the same time pushing the Gunsel forward into the room. He heard Terry's swift intake of breath. In the time that it took her to take another, the damp man was around the door, shutting it by leaning back across the portal with his giant weight. Terry's eyes went from the body on the floor to the looming black-clothed figure that was Remsdorf. She tried a smile, but it was a poor, weak one. Remsdorf came forward with deceptive speed for one his size and bulk. In a second, he was upon her before she had time to scream, although that would have been of little avail at this hour of night, with the storm outside, and the hotel's rooms that were occupied by the sleeping. In another instant, she was in his bare hands, and then she knew enough to do nothing but smile up at him. She was wearing something revealing that she knew he or any other man would like, and she placed her life on that. "Darling," she murmured, using all her willpower to keep the tremble out of her voice and the fear out of her eyes. "Darling, I'm so glad to see you." Remsdorf held her non-committally, and in his small, opaque eyes she could see nothing that told her what her fate might be, only a mirror of her own face, with its set, frozen smile that was a terrible mask, hiding the exploding emotions within. The damp man had been thinking in his ponderous, inexorable, and wholly objective manner, and little surprised him. All the time that Terry had played with him, a side of him, divorced from that part of his nature which had been pleased and flattered, had stood off and evaluated the situation as it really was. Earlier that night, Lothar had recognized that his worst suspicions were probably true. The rendezvous with Terry that turned into a rendezvous with 3 eggs. But during the crosstown drive there was still in the back of his mind, which desperately wanted to believe in her, the thought that possibly this Frankie Macklin and his friends had overheard or somehow come to know about the $10,000 he had withdrawn and was bringing her. That was not entirely beyond the realm of possibility, and they, rather than the girl, had kept the meeting. It was, of course, a small hope to cling to, but it had been with him until that moment when he'd stood the body of Macklin in the opening of the door, and Terry had unknowingly greeted the Gunsel affectionately, wondering out loud if he'd hoisted the money from that big baboon. It was, of course, all too plain, whether the fact was a pleasant one to accept or not. Terry played at the game of knowing nothing for a moment, as she drew him back without seeming to the corner of the room, until she came up against her own dressing table. It was a game between them, a silly game, and an entirely deadly one. She used the wiles that women have used from time immemorial, and which she was so naturally well endowed to use. She swayed her body lightly, as well as she could in his restrictive grasp, and she offered her lips, closing her eyes as she did so. And behind her she fumbled with one hand she had won free at something in her dressing-table drawer. He slapped her first across the mouth. It was not hard, but his hand was heavy, and it made a wet sound. She opened her eyes wide with the shock of the blow, and saw that it was only the first. But she had what she wanted now, and when her free hand came out from behind her, it held a knife. She was sure he didn't see, his bulk looming so far above her, bending her backward. When she struck him in the back with the blade, driving it home with all the strength of her arm, she tried to swivel sideways to free herself from his monstrous body when it would fall in agony from her attack. Instead, there was no more satisfying reaction on the damp man's part than a tightening of his hands on her shoulders. It was incredible to her, and this part was the worst of it. Her flaying arms caught at the weapon buried to its hilt in his back. She beat at it, and hammered at it, and the strange sounds in her ear was her own voice whimpering, the voice made for soft songs and foolish men, now crying and sobbing for her life. The knife was where she had struck it, squarely beneath his shoulder blades, and its blade was long, she knew. She had a passing satisfaction as one hand came away with a wet, sticky substance soiling her fingers. One giant hand came up again, and another heavy blow fell, making her ears ring and her senses reel. He was swinging his huge arms and fists at her ponderously, like a windmill. But somewhere her quickness and strength had left her, and though she could see the blows coming, she could not dodge them, and they fell with a rhythmic tattoo upon her face and shoulders and upper body. As Terry slipped to the floor, hurt and sick almost beyond caring, she had time, as though in a dream, to see that hand of hers which had touched the stickiness from his back where her knife had struck, as though, in the seeing of his life's blood on her fingers, there would be some small satisfaction. She looked and knew something that made her doubt what sanity remained in her battered head. For the almost colourless substance on her fingers, whatever it may have been, was certainly not blood. Those last seconds seemed an eternity. For a fraction of them, he left her lying where she had fallen, her clothes nearly completely ripped from her body, and he half turned for a moment, for some small reason that had nothing to do with her life or his dreadful purpose concerning it. She saw the knife end in his back, and it glinted as testimonial to her supreme failure. There was a wet stain from the rent it caused in his coat, and from that stain was more of the stuff drying on her hand, and it, too, also could not be blood. Perhaps he caught the direction of her eyes. At any rate, he reached almost casually behind him and wrenched the knife from its lodgment in his massive body. The blade came away, but there was still no redness. She was sure of that because he was holding it as he moved closer to her and bent, almost kneeled as though in supplication, the knife in his hand as offering. She was fascinated by its unreddened blade. From out of her youngness and woman strength that was far from its designed destiny or length of life, she summoned the energy to gasp, You're not human." He bent closer, ever closer, as though to kiss her, and as he did, he said, "No, Terry, my dear, I'm not human." There was something else in her to be said, a plea, a begging for mercy, a promise of everything, for loss of life is the greatest loss. But if she had had the strength to say it, it would still not have been said, for the beginnings of it were ripped and torn from her very throat by her own blade, as he plunged the knife into her, smashing and tearing and rending the bones and tissue and flesh of her neck that so many foolish men had worshipped. The damp man's exit from a scene of crime, or as he always called such occasions, the scene of justice, was accomplished with a minimum of effort, and, as usual, without observation. 3. Lothar Remsdorf Jr. had been involved in much more than his share of peccadilloes during his span of existence, would be involved in many more. This was his own opinion. Experience and the fortunate position of his tremendous inherited wealth had taught him that there were few scrapes from which one could not extricate oneself with the use of superior intelligence or money and influence. Some occasions took one solution, others took another, but the worst would yield to both. As time passed, in the dark patterns of his life, Lothar felt never regret, rarely sadness, but instead a kind of bitter resentment and frustration that filled the hulk of him with a burning hatred towards his less peculiarly endowed fellow men and women. His actions became less overt and direct. He became more a recluse, and in this a society which had never accepted his unusualness was glad to concur. Remsdorf, at vast expense and with the utilization of every likely means, set about collecting all the data he could on the experiments of his brilliant scientist father, Remsdorf Sr. He was, of course, primarily and overwhelmingly interested in the facts and circumstances attendant upon the experiment whose culmination produced the knowledge that was him. Much of the data pertinent to this, as well as other of his father's scientific adventures, had been destroyed in the explosion that had cost Remsdorf Sr. his life, and which, in later years, would be attributed to the son who, like Frankenstein's monster, had turned resentfully upon his maker. Other levels of information which would now be invaluable to the damp man's investigations had undoubtedly been gathered not on paper, but alone in the head of the scientist himself. Still, in time, Remsdorf accumulated a considerable portmanteau of details concerning the physiological, cellular, and radiary aspects of altering human tissue and the organic balance between vital substances. Through the months and the years, the damp man collected not only paper information and scientific data, but instruments and apparatus which he thought might eventually be useful to him. Some of these were built on unusual and outre lines, along specifications from those of his father's secret files, which he'd been able to salvage at least in part. There were two thoughts in this connection in the back of Remsdorf Jr.'s mind. One was assuredly the dominant. That was his desire to perpetuate himself and to establish on this earth others of his kind. Precisely how this would be done was the subject of many of his musings and speculations. There was, of course, the orderly method of conventional biological progression, but this was possibly a chance formula. The other was to subject additional human organisms to the same man-made tampering to which he had been subjected. And then, but only rarely, was the discreet wonder that possibly the energies that had made him what he was could be reversed, and carrying that thought to conclusion, he would therefore become what he had been once before, in some unremembered limbo. This last was not a matter he spent much analysis on, for in actuality the damp man had come to believe supremely in his superiority. To become one of the masses would be a recession of the most shocking sort. It was his chief problem then to find one, a female of course, who would be kindred with him, and who would help realize his dream of a racial and biological empire which could revolutionize our society, our mores and our destinies, not alone as individuals, but as a composite universe. To this end, all of Remsdorf's efforts were bent, but there still remained, with the ebb and flow of success in his scientific adventures and experimentations, the quest for a goal, the goal. And then one day, almost as by accident, he saw a picture in a newspaper. There were other faces and figures, but he had eyes for only one, the one which even the newspaper photo showed to be golden-haired, very pretty and statuesque in proportions. The young lady in question, the story read, was a Miss Linda Mallory, and she was competing in a swimming meet to be held in a near state, along with the others in the picture. Remsdorf was at that contest, and was completely taken with the girl. He watched for her entry in future meets, and through devious means ascertained her address at a big city women's hotel. His campaign to meet and win the young lady for his own could not allow for defeat. To be sure, he had run across an initial rejection early in the chase. He had come upon her at one of the fashionable club pools where swimming races were being held. As nearly as it was possible for him to be so affected, the damp man was confused by meeting face to face this statuesque, perfectly moulded, young blonde beauty. He mumbled something, although of course they had not been introduced. When he tried to remember afterward, he could not remember exactly what he had said, but the essence of it he could guess, and it must have sounded strange to the uninitiated girl.
"Between us, we can make a new world."
She had brushed past him in some embarrassment, he had recalled. There entered into the picture not long afterward a meddlesome young man by name George Pelgrim, who was, Lothar had to admit, a rather wily adversary in his capacity as reporter for the big metropolitan Gazette. He too met Linda Mallory, and they became acquainted, much to Remsdorf's irritation. That she had told Pelgrim about her other admirer was evident nearly at once, for one night late in fog-filled streets he had followed them home from a movie, and had confronted the young man, who, in traditional manner, had barred the way while Linda had gone on ahead. Lothar had been enjoying the prospect of beating the newspaper man's brains from his head, when car lights had shone through the yellow mist far down the avenue, and he'd had to leave Pelgrim lying unconscious from their fight in the street, but still, he was afraid, very much alive. It was, of course, a passing irritation that he had caught up with a girl some days later who he believed was Linda, for was she not wearing one of Linda's dresses, which he knew well from observation? In her fear and struggling, she had made a considerable scene at a place where such commotion can cause questions and embarrassing apprehension. Then, at once, Remsdorf realized that it was not Linda, but another girl of almost equal proportions, wearing an identical dress. By that time, there'd only been one thing to do, and Lothar had done it. With the death of the mixed identity girl, the reporter Pelgrim's efforts to hinder Remsdorf had been redoubled. Still, he had plans for Pelgrim. His campaign for Linda was not ended. His race of new people would still be born. George Pelgrim laid the diary down, but there were some immensities about this macabre situation that staggered the mind. Pelgrim went back to the diary then, and pored over some of the back pages filled with calculations, summaries, equations, and formulas. Most of it was as Greek to him, but here and there were conclusions worded in scientific language, but still not too hard for the lay mind to comprehend. Pelgrim read on, and it was some time later, having exhausted the remaining pages of the journal, that he descended again into the laboratory basement of the building. It was eerie to walk in that place with its strange, damned equipment, and those three grisly things on the floor. Corpses they were. Two of them Remsdorf's gunsels who'd been brought here to guard the place, and the third an assisting doctor in white smock, who probably knew little of what he was doing, but was willing to assist in anything for the sort of fee that Lothar would be glad to pay. There was, of course, the transfusion theory of Remsdorf's experimentation, but there was also what the damp man had somewhat sardonically called in his diary the evolution stage, and that was set up here like some futuristic monster, with electrons and such arrayed in twin banks complementing each other and focusing across an X middle stage. George was still wondering about his method once he had quit this place for good, and that would be soon, for the first streaks of dawn would be upon him in another hour or two, of tipping off the police. An anonymous phone call, he thought, would do it. Simply the brusque message that there had been some trouble up at View Cliffs. The authorities would come and find the three bodies. Remsdorf, of course, was gone forever into the myriad moisture of the world. Pelgrim thought that there would be nothing to implicate Linda or himself, but any thorough investigation could not fail to give them both a clean bill of health when all the facts, supported by the precious Remsdorf diary, were established. George was less sure of the attitude of the authorities on the complete disappearance of Lothar Remsdorf Jr., but that was a matter that concerned him only theoretically. Another most practical consideration in Pelgrim's mind was how he could win approval to publish this record, the story of the infamous damp man and his machinations, for the yarn certainly out-thrilled fiction. As he thought, his flashlight flicked over the apparatus of the stage. It reminded him in some ways of a giant diathermy machine. To get a better look at some of the mechanics of the machine, he stepped up on the stage, peering up at neon sign-like tentacles that reached high on either side, as though to form an arbor of equipment. He was careful not to touch anything, for the exact mechanism was beyond him. This part of the Damp Man's saga smacked a bit of quackery. George had the newspaper reporter's contempt of paraphernalia, and in this elaborate form it reminded him of the grade C thrillers that the movie makers put out for years for a gullible, easily impressed audience. Craning his neck to look upward made him feel suddenly dizzy. He recalled prosaically that he hadn't eaten in many hours, and that was probably the reason for the nausea and weakness that was catching up with him. Pelgrim stepped off the stage, noting the control box on the far side with its switch and the red lights that marked one end of its radius. But he was concerned now with getting upstairs. He went through the house quickly and quietly, visiting last the upstairs room, wherein hung the huge life-size portrait of Lothar Remsdorf Jr. He himself would keep the diary, but it would not do to have curious police discover the lopsided hanging picture and a small broken wall safe behind it. He straightened the picture carefully, after having seen that the safe looked as intact as he could make it. The picture of Remsdorf struck him again as it had before, powerfully and with impact. As he backed away, almost as though with awe, he changed his opinion that the eyes had no life, for there seemed a spark in them now, and the face that had been expressionless now almost seemed to smile back at him. He was feeling very, very tired, and his imagination was that of an exhausted man who'd known neither food nor sleep over too long a period. He made an exit from the room before, as he chided himself, Lothar Remsdorf Jr. should step out of the picture suddenly, come to life and pursue him through the dark, dead old building. Outside, Pelgrim made his way to his parked car, which had been left discreetly some distance away. He drove nearly all the way back to the city, before he found an inconspicuous spot with an all-night counterman dozing on duty. With his fedora down over his eyes, George went in, made his way to the corner phone booth and phoned his tip about View Cliffs. The rest was up to the police. He'd been in his city apartment only a few minutes when his phone jangled. It was Linda who'd come on ahead of him and was now safely ensconced again at Mrs. Brumley's boarding house. "Darling, are you all right?" "Of course," he told her. "You ought to be asleep at this hour." Dawn was at his windows as he spoke, although it's just about time for a new day, isn't it? They talked of this and that, and for some reason George said nothing about the diary, or of his return visit to View Cliffs. "I thought you'd been out on an all-night bender or something," she chided him. "Celebrating my near demise at the hands of that monster?" His laugh was a little hollow. It had been a close escape. For a young lady who almost contributed to an unusual experience, he kidded back, striking the same light vein. "You're remarkably gay." "It's because we're free of him," she said fervently. "Free of him forever, George. We don't have to sneak around anymore, or phone each other from pay booths and not get together for fear he's watching or following. He's gone forever, George." "That's right," said Pelgrim. "He's gone forever. Now, try and get some sleep, Linda." There were a few more endearments, and then they hung up. It was true what Linda Mallory had said. They could walk arm in arm anywhere they pleased, day or night, down bright or dark streets, without looking behind, without wondering at every step that beat in rhythm with their own, without wondering if the chance glance of a passer-by might betoken some agent directed by him. It was as Linda said, as though they had come out from under a giant cloud, as though they had walked through a dark, evil forest and emerged into the sunlight and joy of these years of youth that were still theirs. Her face was radiant as she'd look at him and squeeze his arm affectionately. "I suppose," the blonde girl would convey, "I suppose I'll never forget that business, nor you, George. I might on the surface, but not way down deep inside. They say that everything that happens to you is recorded there forever. But even now, and it's only a few weeks ago, the last of it, even now it seems a dream, like something that happened to someone else. Something that I've been told about that didn't really happen to me. You know what I mean? And George would nod his head. And Linda, like people in love, would poke at him playfully and say with mock petulance, "You're not even paying any attention to what I'm saying. You're thinking about something else. Now don't you go and grin sheepishly, George, and try and pretend you've been listening all the time. That's the trouble with you newspaper men. So many funny things happen to you. I suppose your little run-in with my damp man is sort of back-page stuff to you now." He wagged his head non-committally. "George," she went on, "what about getting some of that published? You know, you used to say it would make such a wonderful story. Won't that old city editor of yours, or the feature editor down there, take it?" He surprised her by shaking his head. "Things like that really shouldn't be printed, Linda. I agree with them now." "Well," she sighed, squeezing his elbow again lovingly. "And then they talk about women changing their minds." But George was thinking of something else, and he'd been thinking of it for several days. It came to him first, perhaps, appropriately enough. Don't they say that's when many men do their best thinking? When he was shaving at his bathroom mirror. When he left Linda this night, he went over the whole business again, and read the diary as he had before now enough times to know parts of it almost by heart. The beginning, for instance. It all fitted in nicely, and he was satisfied that he had discovered the why as well. It made him smile to recall that only tonight Linda had taken his hand across the dinner table in a downtown cafe with a gesture of affection, and then said with that little bit of mother-hen disapproval he'd always found amusing, "George, you've been working on the office safe or something. Your hands are all scratched up. No, you've been fighting with other girls. There's a nick on your face." Silly girl, but of course he had had to make sure. That time, the first time when he'd been shaving, had been so frightening, so hopefully inconclusive. You know, men cut themselves when they shave. Blood comes, is supposed to come. Then he'd remembered, thought and thought, until the memory was clear in his mind. The stage, and the apparatus, and the position of the switch on the far side. How was he to know there would be no loud, impressive hum of machinery, sparks flying, or wires glowing? But the switch had pointed to 2 red letters on its control face, 2 red letters pregnant with meaning. On. He watched. Once and a while he nicked a finger, just to make sure. He was sure. As the days had passed, though, something else had happened to him, which he supposed went with it all. For now he was no longer frightened or stunned, and he knew the next step with simple positiveness. Tomorrow he would ask Linda, and of course her answer would be yes, and that would be the beginning. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time.